Hey, Gino, you going dumb. Hey, let's go. Yeah. I'm going dumb.
All right, we're back, and today we're talking about the Transition Sentinel V3. Changes in bike geometry have gotten a little bit less radical over the years. We're not seeing huge jumps between each version anymore. Considering that, it's still rare to see a bike that is steeper than its previous version, but that's exactly what we have with the Sentinel V3. It is steeper than the V2. And that makes a lot of sense because when the Sentinel V2 came out, it was the longest traveled 29er in the lineup. Now that the Spire exists, the Sentinel can kind of slot into that all-mountain category. Rather than having to span the all-mountain and enduro categories, it can be a little bit more purpose-built. So, do those geometry and suspension refinements that we see on the Sentinel make it a better all-mountain bike? Stick around to find out. So, what is new about the Sentinel V3? Let's jump into it. First of all, the geometry sees a slight correction, I guess, with the head tube angle getting a little bit steeper. We're now at 64 degrees even. We still have 150 millimeters of rear wheel travel and 160 up front. However, you can bump the rear wheel travel to 160 millimeters if you like. This time around, we do get a flip chip to accommodate both 29-inch wheels and MX setups, although it is only sold as a 29er, which is how I've ridden it this entire time. On the V3, we also have size-specific chainstays that fall on the longer length for bikes these days. And for the first time ever on a transition bike, we see internal frame storage, and it's pretty cool because the door is independent of the water bottle bosses, so you don't have to support the weight of the water bottle on the door, which should lead to less rattling and less problems with doors falling off. And finally, kind of a cool touch, we have universal internal cable routing, so you can run cables however way you would like. So for the weirdos that run their front brake on the right, you can continue being weird. All in all, this is a very well thought out bike by Transition. Starting with the Sentinel going uphill. Two main things stood out to me on the Sentinel on the climbs. First is that refined suspension curve goes a long way in making the bike a much more energetic climber than it used to be. And then the geometry puts your weight in a more central location on the bike. So starting with that suspension design, the new Sentinel features a refined suspension kinematic that keeps you higher in the travel. And this helps give the bike a sportier feel than the previous generation. That goes a long way in helping the Sentinel get to the top of a climb. First, it feels more efficient and snappy. And second, you don't sag into the travel quite as much, so your weight isn't off the back of the bike as much. The new suspension design is noticeably better on steep and punchy efforts and for those out of the saddle efforts. And then over the course of a long day, you're gonna notice that this bike pedals much better. I don't think it's lacking traction by any means, but I do think the old version was more glued to the ground on the loose stuff. So you get in that really steep, loose, techie stuff. The old one will give you more traction than the current one. The body position changes on the Sentinel V3. The geometry now helps keep you between the wheels just a little bit better. Your weight gets shifted forward relative to the wheels now. The chainstay length is 8 millimeters longer, and that seat tube angle is over a degree steeper, meaning you'll have more bike behind you. Essentially, that puts you closer to the front wheel. It's worth mentioning there are 3 chainstay lengths across the 6 sizes of the carbon frame, meaning bikes will mostly be proportional no matter which size you're on. That centered or more forward position is great for sharper handling and keeping plenty of weight on that front wheel for those steep, tough, loose climbs. All of the above features make the Sentinel V3 a pretty sporty climber. It's lively, it's energetic, and for the category, I think it ranks near the top. Previously, it fell somewhere in the middle of the pack, but now I'd argue it's a top contender in the category. So downhill, getting to the fun part, let's chat about it. I loved the previous version of the Sentinel for how it descended. It kind of filled this weird spot between an all-mountain bike and an enduro bike. It was kind of like an interloper, didn't really belong in either category, kind of sat in the middle, I guess. And I really liked it for my style of riding. I don't need an enduro bike. Sometimes I want a bit more than an all-mountain bike. And that's exactly where that bike sat. But now, this version sits squarely in the all-mountain category. And I'd argue that's actually a really good thing for most people. So I have 3 standout features to discuss about this bike. First of all, let's start with the updated suspension. Like on the climbs, the bike rides higher in its travel, and that gives it a sportier, more well-rounded feel overall. With that, of course, the suspension feel is firmer and a little less comfortable than before, but I'd argue it's now better suited for the category. The Sentinel is now much better on rolling terrain, punchy ups and downs, as well as holding speed on smoother terrain. By sitting higher in the travel, there's still plenty in reserve for those bigger impacts, and I wouldn't say it's too difficult to get into the travel when needed either. So it sits fairly high until you need to get into it, and then it lets you get into it. It handles those bigger bumps and those big G-outs very nicely. Second feature is the sharper handling. While the bike gets a bit longer overall, the head tube angle gets steeper. Combining that with the more central body position puts more weight on the front of the bike, giving you more responsive handling. The bike feels sharper and more willing to change lines, especially at slower speeds and on flatter terrain. One of the biggest differences I've noticed in this version versus the previous is how much stiffer the frame feels. So the shock bridge is now one solid carbon piece instead of two, which gives the bike way more lateral stiffness. And that stiffness is certainly noticeable. The bike feels sharper and snappier out of the corners, and when you get into the rough, high-speed hits, it seems to track a straighter line rather than squirming around and getting kicked around offline as much. Combining all of these characteristics makes the new Sentinel ride much more like a long travel smuggler than it does a shorter travel Spire. And now feels much livelier, much quicker, much more engaging, and just better suited for that all-mountain category where you're going to be riding a wide variety of terrain, or a wide variety of rider types and skill levels will be on this bike. So now let's make a couple of comparisons. First one, Sentinel V2 versus Sentinel V3. Kind of been doing that this whole time, but let's dive in. Sentinel V2 feels softer, plusher, and much more aggressive than the V3. And I think it is more capable than the V3, but at the expense of versatility. So while the V3 still skews towards the descents, I think it now sits right in the middle of the all-mountain category. It's much more balanced than the V2. It offers a more responsive ride quality that engages the rider more. It is clearly the winner on the climbs and in easy terrain. And I also like the bike's ability to run MX setups if that's what you're into. Now let's talk about Sentinel V3 versus the new Ibis Ripmo V3. On paper, these bikes are pretty much identical. Same travel, very similar geo, but out on the trail, they actually feel very, very different. I mean, in the big picture, they're similar, they fall in the same category, but for how similar they look on paper, it's pretty surprising how different they feel out on the trail. I think most of it comes down to the suspension design. The Ripmo is plusher, softer, poppier, and just a little happier to goof around. Sentinel is stiffer, firmer, and much more responsive. And because of that, it does feel a bit more serious, and it might even be a better climber than the Ripmo. And next we have the Sentinel V3 versus the Hightower V4, but because I'm a doofus and broke my collarbone, I haven't been able to ride the Hightower. That is coming, and we will dive into that showdown, but I am very excited to ride these bikes back to back. So what would I change about the Sentinel V3? There is not a lot, to be honest. This is a very well thought out bike from Transition. If I had to pick some nits though, I would like to see a heavier duty casing on that rear tire. And while I'm happy riding mine as a full 29-inch bike, it would be nice to see some MX options come stock for people who want that MX bike. So who is the Sentinel V3 for? I think this is for the mountain biker, or for the purist, or someone who just likes riding bikes. It's not full of fancy bells and whistles, there's no marketing gimmicks, there's no proprietary BS, and despite all that, it's a damn good bicycle. It's a mountain bike with ports to route your damn shifter cables if you want them. And it takes that same mentality out to the trails. It goes uphill, it goes downhill, it doesn't pigeonhole itself into some tiny little weird niche. It's happy in all kinds of terrain, and it never gets in your way. It goes as hard or as easy as you would like. It's just happy to be out in the woods. So that's going to do it for the Sentinel. We'll see you next time.